back to episode 32 of the Bible Connection podcast. So guys, this is a weekly podcast. It follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are a couple of my good friends, Brandon Stooksbury.
Shalomi, homie.
Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
And John Steinke.
What was Shalomi, homie?
You're welcome.
Just trying to keep them on their toes. Okay, so this week...
like the new VeggieTales. Something.
He has kids. It has something to do with that, I'm sure.
All right, so this week we get to discuss the first half of the book of Isaiah. You guys ready to rock and roll with that one?
Sure.
All right, so over the last few weeks in our church's reading plan, we've been discussing the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So now as we begin to read the book of Isaiah, I want to know who is Isaiah and when did he live, and just explain to us what is a prophet.
Okay. Isaiah, his name in Hebrew, Yeshayahu, is a name that should be pretty familiar. It's pretty similar to Yeshua, and the same name as Jesus. He means the salvation of Yahweh. And so right from the get-go, his name is giving you a clue into what his message is going to be. He lived in the time of the kings, so it's been a while since we've read 2 Kings, but a few names that might sound familiar if you read through 2 Kings this year. Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah were all kings in Judah, and their reign, lasted, different times. Uzziah and Hezekiah reigned for a while. Jotham and Ahaz had a pretty short rule as king. Isaiah was alive and preaching during all four of their rules, which we see in the first chapter, verse 1. It says, "The vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah." So we have a pretty good historical time period. 740-ish to 680-ish was his ministry. He was a prophet, as you said, which comes from like the Hebrew word nabi, means somebody who is selected by God to share his revealed word. So he's speaking on behalf of God, sharing his messages, revealing God's truth to the people. And he's speaking to Judah and Jerusalem.
So, this dude was legit. So he walked around for 3 years naked and barefoot. The text literally says he walked around buttocks uncovered.
The command was to leave your loincloth behind. He also had a family, which is pretty awkward when you talk about that. He had an unnamed wife, you see in chapter 8, and at least 2 sons. His oldest son was Shear Jashab. God has this thing with his prophets you're going to see again in the future where he'll command them to name their children something, and it's so that, the kind of the idea behind it is that long after the prophet is done ministering, this child will be a living reminder of the message that was given. And so the first son given matches one of the first major themes of Isaiah that hopefully we'll unpack. His name means a remnant shall return. So we'll talk about that remnant. And his youngest son had a mouthful of a name, Maher Shalal Hashbaz, and it's like a full sentence. His name means the plunder speeds, but the prey hastens. So that's super clear,
Yeah,
it's popular in school.
It's a poetic description discussing how the rewards of following God righteously are at hand, and those who are not following God, they are a prey that is fleeing quickly. And so his children are kind of bearing that namesake for him.
All right, so Thomas Schreiner in The King in His Beauty began his commentary on Isaiah by saying, "The breadth and the depth and beauty of Isaiah exceed our capacity, I don't know why I'm struggling to say that word, to grasp and my ability to express." So what is it about the book of Isaiah that makes it such a daunting book of the Bible to read?
Well, for one thing, its length. It is a pretty substantially sized book.
66 chapters, right?
Yeah, and there's some interesting theories on to why there's 66 chapters.
66. It's in the Bible.
Maybe look into that. We don't have time for that here, but it's interesting. Also, when you read the book of Isaiah, you'll see multiple themes, and not only are there multiple themes, but the timeline is not a straight timeline. Sometimes it'll go a little ways and then it'll come back, and then it'll go a little ways and it'll come back a little bit. So that makes it a little bit difficult to.
What did you call that? Recursive?
Yeah, but I don't want to use big words unless we have to.
Okay, good.
But and sometimes there are places where we may not be familiar with. There's names that we may not be familiar with. And like I said, the themes. There's themes of judgment and salvation in ways that we are not typically accustomed to talking about them like that. Also, a lot of times people are called types of trees, and what God is doing with that is he's clearing away nations. Sometimes are in reference to a tree, and the judgment upon the nation is that it's cut down. So things like that, and tracing those throughout the scriptures, and not just reading Isaiah and just strictly. The biggest thing about the book of Isaiah is don't read the book of Isaiah and interpret it with your newspaper, right?
What do you mean by that?
You cannot take 2022 thinking and read it into Isaiah. You will misread it. Same thing with the book of Revelation, and the book about the Revelation and Isaiah are very similar. You'll see cataclysmic events that are taking place. The sun not shining, the moon, apocalyptic things. Yeah, good word. And you may be tempted to read them literally, as they will happen exactly like they are written. But remember, we've talked about this a little bit before, but remember that there is a massive amount of symbolism that is in this book, right? And so symbolism, we shouldn't take it as a word for word, that the sun will stop shining or whatever, but it's talking about a judgment on a nation. Basically, if you were in Babylon, right, and everything, America the same way, everything that you knew about how the civilization is working and going along, it's about to be turned up on its head and completely devastated. And the best way for the biblical authors to explain that is these cataclysmic type language. So,
would you call it poetry?
I guess it would be a type of poetry. What do you?
I know. There's a few forms of poetry, like merisms. Again, that's where, like you say, from the tallest mountain to the lowest valley, and what it means is everything in between. But it's not relying on a lot of poetic literature as much as the Psalms and Proverbs that we just left.
Right.
I would like to echo, I completely agree with what you're saying. What we're not saying here, though, is that that this is like some kind of book that requires secret knowledge or understanding to unpack this symbolism. Like what we hope to do as we talk about Isaiah, and we hope you're doing as you read it, is that you're practicing, just the same type of Bible interpretation you do when you go to any text. You recognize that this is a text with an author who wrote to an audience, that it falls into the to the message of the whole Bible. It's not its own thing. But when you deal with a really long book that's got symbolism and it deals with a historical time period that you are not very comfortable with, when I talk about Moses or I talk about David, you have a general idea of what you picture Israel was like. When I talk about Hezekiah, you're like, when was that again? Unless you're like a nerd that loves Second Kings like me, which I hope more of you would be. It's just going to be a little bit more work from you to read Isaiah. I'm not saying that you have to be a super smart person to understand Isaiah. I'm not saying that there's some we've got it figured out. We've got the secrets about Isaiah, and if you've ever read it, you just didn't get it. What I am saying is it takes a little bit of work. You need to trace out the themes of those symbols. When you see words that have been used previously in the Old Testament, go back and see what he's referring to. When you see it quoted in the New Testament, read back to Isaiah and see what context is going on.
I'd say it's really important too, as we read through the different metaphors and we see some of this language, just to have a baseline understanding of what went on historically. So you see the unfaithfulness of the people under the number of kings and what they were doing, and what it led up to is ultimately their judgment in Assyria and Babylon. God using both of them for the judgment. And we see that Isaiah is speaking right in the middle of that. So having that background understanding from a historical perspective, as John just mentioned, reading through those will help you understand the metaphors that are being communicated and why are they being communicated. I would hope that as you read through that, you can see the message of salvation being unfolded and what is being communicated from Israel's judgment, and what had happened to that ultimately led to the servant who came and fulfilled what God promised to do from early Genesis. So we see all of this wrapped around and ultimately fulfilling what God has promised. But I think from a historical perspective, just having a baseline or looking at an outline of maybe what happened can help you really understand what's going on in the book much better.
You know, I completely forgot to remember to do that as we started this. Here, I'll try to give a really quick overview. So if you remember David was made king, and he conquered his city, Jerusalem, where his son Solomon ruled after him and built the temple. Well, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, he unwisely and foolishly rejected his father's wisdom, and the kingdom divided in his days. And so for the rest of the history of Israel in the Old Testament, they were a divided kingdom. The north was called Israel, and they were eventually conquered by Assyria, who that's going to be, referenced in Isaiah. And the south would last a couple hundred more years, but eventually, more like 150 years, eventually would fall to Babylon. And so those two different kingdoms, Judah and Israel, are going to be talked about, and they are a different thing in Isaiah's day.
All right, so one of the first themes that becomes apparent in the book of Isaiah is the judgment of Israel and Jerusalem. So what is Isaiah's message to Israel concerning judgment, and how does this relate to us today?
So right off the bat, in Isaiah chapter 1, you see that listed off the wickedness of Judah until you get to a very interesting verse 9. It says, "If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and been like Gomorrah." Okay, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. But look at the next verse. "Hear the word of the Lord. You rulers of Sodom, give ear to the teaching of our God, you peoples of Gomorrah." Who is he talking about? He's talking to Judah. He's calling them Sodom and Gomorrah. So right off the bat, this is really, really bad. Things are not going well. You see, if God rained down fire from heaven on Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet his chosen people, now he's referring to them as Sodom and Gomorrah, things have gone seriously wrong.
Yeah, all the way back to Deuteronomy 32, Moses had already, when he established the law in Israel, talked about how Israel would be brought to God's terms if they did not obey. If they came into the land and did all the things that they've been doing, idolatry and failing to keep a watchful eye for the oppressed and injustice and perversion in the land, then they would be brought to terms by God. And some scholars have called Isaiah kind of like a lawyer who's bringing them to a covenant lawsuit. And so when you see the charges, you're almost like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like the judgment that's on Israel and Judah seems so intense compared to the judgment that you're going to see on the other nations. And I want to remind you, all the way back to Leviticus, what happened when the average person offered a sin offering versus the priest? The offering that the priest was required to bring was a much higher cost than the average person. And Israel, as God's chosen nation, as his kingdom of priests and a royal priesthood, go back to Exodus 19, they are being brought to God with the charges of their transgression against his loving kindness and covenant keeping. They've broken covenant when God has been faithful. And so he's talking to them. If you go to, in your Bible, chapter 4, and chapter 5, of Isaiah, he kind of gives this judgment over them, and he talks about it like it's a vineyard, which can be a little confusing. And maybe if you got to this point, you're a little confused. Let me try to help you a little bit. He says, "Let me sing for my beloved concerning his vineyard. I looked for the grapes, but it yielded wild grapes." And the imagery he's building out here is very similar to what we see in the New Testament. You'll know somebody's faithfulness by their fruit. Rather than the grapes he would expect from the vineyard that he's planted in Israel, they're wild. And
I would like to build off that. So the wild there is from Hebrew bet ushim. So those grapes are not just wild, but rather rotten. So I think a better translation would be rotten, spoiled grapes that are of no use.
And I think Jesus is alluding to this in John 15. So I'm sorry.
So yes, and rather than this being all, one of the great things when you see this symbolism and metaphors, and we told you that's why sometimes you get confused when you read Isaiah, just keep reading. They'll often explain their own metaphors. And so he explicitly says, the vineyard, verse 7, of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. He looked for justice, but he found bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he found an outcry. Woe, woe to those who join house to house and field to field until there's no room, and they make themselves to dwell alone. He's saying these people are greedy. They're rather than living in covenant community, they're trying to enhance their riches and the size of their fields. They're unjust. They're perverse. He goes on to talk about how they live in drunkenness and they have no regard for God. So the specific reason for judgment isn't some vague, arbitrary, you've just not been, trying your hardest. The Lord is looking at this kingdom that he planted in this land in order to fill the world with his glory and be a light to the nations. And instead, they have done everything the wrong way. They've basically taken everything that's good and called it evil, and everything that's evil and called it good, which you see in chapter 5, verses 20 through 21. And so the Lord is going to bring his judgment in the day of the Lord, which hopefully we have some time to unpack what that is a little bit later.
And one more thing I want to add on to the vineyard as we look at here. Anybody who has a vineyard know that it is a huge investment. You just don't pop up a vineyard overnight. So in using this language, the vineyard communicated God put a lot of time into crafting it out so that it may yield good grapes, and it didn't. So there was a big investment that God was putting in Israel, even more so to see that they failed in doing what he commissioned them to do.
Yeah. Well, can I go back to chapter 2, because the chapter 2 you'll see how Isaiah he's talking about judgment, and then in the midst of judgment there's these kind of promises. And at the beginning of chapter 2 it says in chapter 2 verse 2, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the highest mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and the nations shall flow to it. I think this is setting the stage for the rest of the book of Isaiah. This is not the first time we've seen the term latter days, and we've said this before. But latter days, when you see this, you should not be thinking of the tribulation and the millennium and all that stuff. That's not what you should be thinking of. This is a theme that's been playing out from Genesis 49. This is a huge theme. When Jesus came and inaugurated his first coming, that is the beginning of the latter days. We are in the latter days right now, and we have been for 2,022 years, right? These are the latter days, so we should not be...
AKA Messianic era, or whatever you would call it.
It's probably been called 1,000 different things, but biblically, we should see this. We should not see this as, but also in chapter 2, and also at the halfway through chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "Out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes from many, many peoples." So we see here, this is another theme that the law is going forth from Jerusalem, and that we're going to see later on that the coastlands, right, the peoples, the nations that are outside of Israel are waiting for God's law, right? And we should read this, and this is a major theme. Your eyes should be sharpened to see these things, because these are mission texts. We should read the book of Isaiah, and it should pump us up for worldwide missions, because the book of Isaiah, it's going to climax and basically show that in the new heavens, in the new earth, that the world, like this world, where Jesus, I'm post-millennial again, Jesus is going to return to a Christianized world, right? And we are living in the days in which the Lord is doing that, and he's doing it through us, and we should be freaking pumped about it.
Well, even backing up from that a little bit, Isaiah is an optimistic book, and it's so strange to say that because there's so much judgment going on. But if you look at the hope that is continually brought in through that judgment, we're going to see a theme later about how salvation is going to come through judgment for Israel, and ultimately how this optimistic look is going to talk about the redemption and the new creation that is coming for God's people. It's so much so that I want to almost emphasize that when you read the book of Isaiah, I've heard some scholars refer to it as like the fifth gospel. And I got a little bit of an issue with what that is, because I think that when we talk about the gospel of Christ, you should be being clear about what you're referring to. And not that Isaiah wasn't being clear, but my point is, when you're talking about Isaiah, I want you to think of it kind of like this. I've got a very short story. When I was in the high school wrestling team, we had a major match of our team where if we won, we were going to state for the first time in like 20 years.
You fumbled?
No, I wasn't even starting. I was on the bench. But we were sitting there, and there were 2 more matches left, and we needed to win both in order to win. Mm-hmm. And we won the second to last match, and we already started celebrating. And the camera started going, and people were cheering, and the other team got mad. And they didn't understand why we were already celebrating. It's because our heavyweight state champion that year was the last match. Mm-hmm. Already, it's a done deal. We're going to state. Mm-hmm. And he went out there and pinned him in 4 seconds. Mm-hmm. So Isaiah is discussing this messianic figure that we're going to talk about. And he is from the end where it hasn't happened yet. Christ has not yet come, but he's going to start talking about Christ. And it's the message of atonement and redemption that we have in Christ in the back end, all the way back in the days of Israel. He's sharing the gospel of the new covenant to the people.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you that's a great story because of the temptation in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is warning Israel or Judah not to trust in foreign nations. Like, don't in chapter 2, verse 22, stop regarding men in whose nostrils is breath. For what account is he? Multiple times, don't trust in Egypt's horses, right? Wait for the Lord. Wait for, like what you just said. Wait for that heavyweight state champion. We know we're assured of victory, right? It's gonna happen. So I think that's a great story to.
All right, so in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, we see an amazing depiction of Isaiah before the throne of God, receiving his commission to prophesy over Israel. So what can we learn about God from this interaction, and what does it mean that Israel is to keep on hearing but not understand, keep on seeing but not perceive? Also, kind of a sidebar, why is his commission in 6? Like, is there any significance to that?
Well, I don't know specifically if I can answer why his commissioning was in 6. It could be that the prophecies before chapter 6 were given to him before this interaction. And so this is just the order, the prophecies that came after this interaction. Because he could have been serving as a prophet before he had this vision in the year Uzziah died that we see in chapter 6.
Oh, right. Okay.
But I'm not sure about that. Maybe that's just structurally when whoever compiled the book of Isaiah, which could have been Isaiah by his own hand or a scribe, decided to put it in. I'm not sure. Let's separate that into 2 questions, though. What can we learn about God, and then what's the keep on hearing but don't understand? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Book I highly recommend that our youth group goes over with seniors pretty often. The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul. Open my eyes.
R.C. Sproul.
Is that? Do you have to pronounce it that way?
Yes.
Okay, Sproul.
Coming from the guy that says Esther.
That's fine.
Gotcha.
When we talk about holiness, it's a really difficult word to define because you can't. You won't. You're not going to define it well. It is a category of...
Are you talking about holy?
Yeah, it's a category that belongs to God alone. If I was going to try to help you understand what I'm trying to say here, the Hebrew word kados, when you try to translate holy, it's a description of something that you're aware of that you just can't evoke that description with any other words. Have you ever seen a baby that's like 9 months old the first time grandma puts ice cream in its mouth and like it doesn't know how to react to that level of cold? Mm-hmm. Or have you ever seen like a child on those videos that gets glasses for the first time and sees color for the first time in his life, and he starts to cry. Holiness, people talk about how it means being set apart from God. It's really just that reaction that you have when you notice that God is so distinct from anything else that man can be as he approaches, that the only way to discuss it is in words like sanctus or sanctified or holy. It's a completely different experience than what it means to be human.
And when looking at this, in Hebrew, when you want to emphasize something, you repeat it twice. But here you see holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And the only word to describe God ever that's repeated 3 times is holy.
And something we need to do here, Isaiah includes, he gives us a timestamp here, right? So he tells us that this is in the year that King Uzziah died, right? So that gives us a timestamp. But that's not the only reason that this is here. He's letting us know that the king of Israel, the king of Judah here is dead, right? But this vision that's taking place here, he's seeing someone on the throne, right? There is a king in Israel and Judah, right? There's a king not only of Israel and Judah, but of the whole world. Not only of the whole world, but of all of creation, right? And that king is sitting on the throne, and he's high and lifted up, right? And the train of his robe is filling the temple, right? And I would argue that the temple is the cosmos here. But what we need to see here is that Yahweh is king, right? And this is another thing that we're going to see throughout the book of Isaiah, that Isaiah it wants you to see this. And what's amazing about this passage is that Isaiah in Isaiah 6 here, you'll see here that the ESV will translate it that the Lord, I saw the Lord on his throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. What's interesting is about this is when the Greek translation of this actually translated, and I would argue is doing some interpreting here, because there a lot of times, especially in the Isaiah section of the Septuagint, there's a lot of translation that goes along with, interpreting that is going along with the translation. But John quotes Isaiah chapter 6 here in John chapter 12, verse 41. And he's talking about Jesus. And it says in John chapter 12, verse 41, I'm trying to remember what it says here. It says, but he saw his glory and spoke of him. And he says he saw his glory. Well, here he's referring to Isaiah chapter 6. What they saw, what Isaiah saw in this temple vision is Jesus. Jesus is Yahweh, right? There's a sense in which going all systematic theology on you, which I don't typically tend to do. But within systematic theology, we understand the Trinity is that there is one God, one essence, that is revealed to us in 3 persons. Right? That's Nicene or orthodoxy. Right? So there's a sense in which the Father is called Yahweh. There are texts like this in which Jesus is called Yahweh, and then there are passages like in Acts chapter 5, I believe, where the Spirit is called the Spirit of Yahweh. Right? So we see here, this is amazing. So the person that Isaiah saw here was Jesus. So this is massively, that's why we need to read Isaiah in tandem. We need to read the Gospels with the understanding of Isaiah.
And so addressing the second half of the question, where we get this confusing message, God says, who will I send? Who will go for me? And then, like Samuel before him, calling out to the voice while he's, Eli's trying to sleep, and, says, "Here am I, send me." And he gets this weird message he's supposed to share with Israel. This judgment that's supposed to come on Judah and Jerusalem is keep hearing but don't understand. Keep seeing but don't notice. Make a heart of this people dull and their ears heavy. And you might be like, why? What a strange message to share. Well, it should bring your memory back to Psalm 115, especially if you were living in the days that King Uzziah died. So Psalm 115 says, and starting verse 2, "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Their idols are like silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but do not smell, hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. They don't make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. And so do all who trust in them." God is taking the prophetic wisdom he's given in Psalms and now proclaiming it as judgment on Israel for their sin. For generations, they've been following after empty idols. They carve these eyes and mouths and ears and make little gods out of wood and stone in their own little hands and say, "This is the gods that led me out of the land of Egypt." And God is judging them. He's saying, Isaiah, go to them and tell them, you are now going to be made like the things you have been worshiping. You are going to have ears, but you will no longer hear my words. You're going to have eyes, but you are no longer going to see the good that I have for my people. And he's slowly going to be working out a miracle that should make all of us Gentiles really excited, that he's going to bring basically a welcome arms into his new covenant to all peoples. And for a time, there's going to be a hardening over Israel.
Yeah, and Greg Beale wrote a book called "We Become What We Worship," and it's incredible. If you want to look into it, he traces out what the message that Isaiah is to preach and how Jesus picks up on this and is accusing the religious leaders of Israel of doing this. And you can see, all you have to do is trace out where this is quoted in the Gospels, especially I think in Matthew 13. Without looking it up, I think that's where it's at. But also, we need to see that the last part of this, that there's this judgment, this message of judgment that is given until you get to the last statement. The holy seed is its stump. Okay, the holy seed. What is this holy seed? Right. This is going back all the way to Genesis 3:15. The one that is going to crush the head of the serpent. That we've traced out the seed and the serpent motif. Isaiah is giving us a clue. He's giving us a key to understanding a major theme throughout the rest of this book. What I've done here is underline holy seed and stump here and put an equal sign underneath it. And this is a hermeneutical, a way to interpret the book of Isaiah that will help you to understand the book of Isaiah, because he is going to, not only Isaiah, but later prophets are going to pick up on this and kind of work this together, this coming seed that is going to ultimately crush the head of the serpent. He's going to trace this out in the book. So.
And so the way he's going to trace that out a little bit throughout the book of Isaiah is he's going to connect this promise that was given back in Genesis, as Brendan was saying, to this stump. And what you're going to see is that as you go to, what is it? Is it chapter 11? Chapter 11. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots that shall bear fruit. And then all the way down to verse 10. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. Isaiah is drawing a new metaphor out of the promise given in the garden. This seed will be like a stump. Okay, what does that mean? Well, God promised David that, his descendant would rule forever and ever. Jesse, being the father of David, Jesus is going to rise up from the Davidic line, and he is going to rule over all of the earth, and he's going to bear the fruit that has been needed for all of these years in expectation to crush the head of the serpent. This is getting a lot of mixed metaphors. My English teacher would really be upset with Isaiah, but he's been building this a lot. This isn't just a one-time. All the way back in chapter 5, when I mentioned the vineyard, he started in chapter 4 by talking about the day that the branch of the Lord should come and be beautiful and glorious, and in that day, the people will start exalting God. This branch of the Lord is going to come up again in other prophets, Jeremiah 22 in chapter 33, Zechariah 3:8 and 6:12. This branch is Christ. It's the king who rules and deals wisely, exalting people and executing them executing justice. He's a servant that will renew the temple. And I think it's even being picked up as Christ is teaching when he says, I am the true vine and you are the branches. Yeah. He is talking about how I am this branch that is bearing fruit. And if you abide in me, you also will be a part of me and have the life that comes through me. And so this is a huge theme that Isaiah is unpacking, and we need to pay attention to this stump and this branch that's growing from it. Even though the stump, you think of a cut down tree. The tree has been cut down. The branches will be thrown into the fire. God is judging Israel, but he's not going to forget the promise that he gave David. And from that stump, the shoot will come up from the Davidic line, and Jesus is going to be faithful to the promises of Abraham and to the promises of David, and the Messianic King will come and bring salvation for the people of God.
Yeah, we need to think about this covenantally. And I say covenantally because we need to remember God's covenant with Abraham, right? God's covenant with Abraham, and it's mentioned multiple times in the book of Isaiah that Abraham's descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars of the sky and of the sand of the sea, right? And we should see this broad covenantal that there's massive amounts of people, but then it narrows down to the point where this tree of Israel through judgment is cut down, like what you were saying, John. And out of this judgment there arises a single way of salvation, and salvation in the Isaiah sense, because Isaiah will give us a category of what salvation means. But salvation is exclusively through this shoot of Jesse, this Davidite or this Davidic servant that is going to. We've seen. We'll look at the servants later on in beginning of chapter 42, but through Jesus is the faithful Israel. Israel is narrowed down to one, basically, covenantally speaking, not literally, but covenantally speaking. Israel is narrowed down to one, and that is Jesus. Now, in Jesus, it starts to broaden back out, right? Jesus is the new Adam, right? And from Jesus, all the nations of the earth are going to come in. The church, Jesus, the church is the new Israel, right? So it funnels down. It funnels down to the point of Jesus, and then it begins to broaden out again. You could look at it like a hourglass. That's how you should kind of look at it. That through Jesus is Israel. He is the faithful Israelite, and the church is the body of Christ. We are the new Israel through Jesus, and it begins to broaden out. And that the story of Isaiah is helping us to understand that. So,
I believe that's it for the first section of Isaiah. We get to talk about the enjoyment of God's salvation next. So, all right, that brings us to the end for this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. So, just want to say thanks so much for everyone who took the time to listen this week. We hope this podcast equips and encourages you as you read, not to confuse or we hope that it just helps. So in doing that, we love to get comments. So if you would comment on our YouTube, or you can send us an email with a question to the email on screen. I just hope you have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 33.